We are now looking at immigration and urbanization. Industrialization goes hands in hand with urbanization. So we looked at that last time with the growth of corporations and monopolies and then the rise of labor unions. So now let's take a look at urbanization and immigration. Cities tend to grow two ways. The cities either grow up and they're going to use a lot of steel, which benefits Carnegie, and they're going to do that through steel skyscrapers and the development of elevators. So they're going to grow up, but they can only go up so far. The other way is that they grow out with bridges, subways, elevated railroad tracks, so people can live further away from the city and commute to work. Cities in this early period tended to be crowded. They tended to be dirty. They tended to have a lot of disease in them. So in this 1920s era, there are going to be some areas that are known as tenements that are going to be very dangerous in terms of crowds, dirt, disease, crime, fires, all that stuff. And it's going to be spurred on by the new immigrants. These are people that are moving from other countries and are living in these areas because they're fairly poor. So cities will emerge between the 1880s and 1890s and become incredibly important in the United States. And a lot of it is caused by the immigration, and you can see here, even out here in westward expansion. The new immigrants are a very particular type of immigrant. They are coming from Europe, but they're not coming from areas that they had traditionally come from. They're coming from Southern Europe, so think Italy and Greece, and Eastern Europe, so think of places like Slovenia and Russia. They tended to be poor, which means that they're going to end up living in the very areas where they land when they get to the United States, which are crowded cities, which we call tenements. They're going to speak very little English compared to the previous generations, those old immigrants, which were the Irish and the Germans. And these new immigrants tend to come from very non-democratic countries, so they don't have experience with democracy that the Germans, the English, and even the Irish are going to have, or the Germans and the English have. So they also tend to have some radical ideas. A lot of these new immigrants tended to come from areas where they were experimenting with socialism, anarchy, even to some extent we're starting to get to like communism in Soviet Russia. They're going to settle in ethnic neighborhoods, immigrant communities. Think of places like Little Italy, where the Italians live, Chinatown, where the Chinese immigrants are going to live. And they're going to be targeted by political machines. And we're going to get more into that in just a minute. See, here's immigrants coming off the vote. Political machines are political groups that are going to target the immigrants and try to take care of them, but also are going to trade those things for their vote. You can see here the old immigrants, they kind of tail off. But the new immigrants are going to have this wild surge between the 1810s and then between 1911 and 1920. There will be a little decline, but this is going to lead to some immigration quotas. So how do Americans feel about this? Well, there's a lot of nativism. Nativism is the belief that the United States should not have immigrants, that there should be only native-born Americans. Not Native Americans, we're not talking about American Indians, native-born Americans. This is based on ethnic prejudice, the idea that these immigrants are going to ruin the country, that workers are going to feel like these immigrants are going to be unskilled, they're going to drive down wages, they're going to drive up the labor force, which drives down wages. And there's going to be a number of immigration restrictions. Even as early as 1882, the Chinese are going to be completely excluded from immigration. You can see here, kick the heathen out. He's got no vote. They're going to kick out this Chinese person. Why? Well, because the West Coast has a history of anti-Asian discrimination. The working people of the West Coast are worried that the wages are going to be driven down. And just in generally, there is a lot of racism towards the Asian population. So this Chinese Exclusion Act is going to discriminate against them. Now, speaking of the political machines, these were political groups in the city run by a boss. You can see the party boss here. Now, the party boss is not elected, but they control the elected officials in all of those ethnic neighborhoods. So the party boss would go into Little Italy and they would find an Italian, get the Italian person elected, and then that Italian person owes the boss favors. And they do that in all the neighborhoods, the Polish neighborhood, the Chinese neighborhood, the Greek neighborhood, the Italian neighborhood. And the boss is pulling all the strings in the city. The officials all owed the boss favors. Reformers attacked political machines, saying that their leaders are accepting bribes for favors, which they did. But you got to remember, in this time, the machine was the only one that's taking care of the immigrants. Otherwise, they're either being overlooked or the nativists are particularly targeting them. So, in a certain sense, the politicians, while they are going to be corrupt and they're going to take more than they should, they are the only ones looking out for those immigrants. Middle class folks, we're going to see they're going to call themselves progressives, hated political machines, partially because the wrong people are given power. That white middle class, they don't want immigrants to have power because that's taking away the white middle class power. But let's talk about that later. Let's first talk about the populists. The populists are farmers, and they're dealing with a lot of money problems in the 1880s and 1890s during this Gilded Age. There's a lot of low crop prices for two reasons. One, mechanized farming. Tractors now are allowing farmers to grow more stuff. And when you grow more, that increases supply, which lowers the price. And there's more land in production because they stole it all from the Native Americans, put it into production out in the Midwest. And now they're growing more crops on more land, which drives down the price they can get for the crops. Now, the farmers are going to blame the railroads, which makes sense because in the Midwest, they can only use the railroads to transport their goods. So they're going to complain that the railroads are charging too high of a rate, and they want the government to regulate the railroads. These are not libertarians. These are not folks that want the government to stay out of their business. They want the government to regulate the railroads. Remember, they took the land from the native populations. They're given that land by the federal government, right? Through the Homestead Act. And you can see here, newly arrived immigrants are going to move out into these areas, along with farmers that didn't have their land in the East, single women and former slaves. They will move into the West, taking advantage of this Farmstead Act, but immigrants are going to move out there as well. This is going to lead the farmers to eventually organize into a national party called the Populist Party. But it starts off as a protest movement. Local farmers would get together and complain together. And then they realized that if they got together in small groups, they could elect local officials that would have to listen to them. And then they realized if they could get these granges, these little local groups of farmers together, if they could get them regionally together, say in Western South Carolina, then all the Western South Carolina politicians, then they realized they could do it at the state level. And then they realized they could get like the Southeast. So all the politicians in Georgia and South Carolina and Florida, they would have to listen to the farmers. So the Granges lead to the regional farmers alliances, and then they realize they can try to do national politics, and they organize those regional farm alliances into the Populist Party. Popular because most of the people in the United States were farmers at this point. And they are opposed to laissez-faire economics. They do not want the government to keep their hands off. Why don't they want the government to keep their hands off? Because they feel like corporations, and particularly the railroads, are taking advantage and exploiting them so that they can become wealthier. The Midwestern states begin to pass laws trying to protect farmers. Again, not laissez-faire. The government is not keeping their hands off. You can see here what they're originally going to try to do is, where is it? There it is. They're trying to organize the railroads. They want the government to pass these things called Granger laws, which are going to limit the amount that railroads can charge for farm products. This is going to get overturned by the Supreme Court because railroads cross state borders, so the state cannot regulate across state lines. So it gets overthrown in what are called these freight rate cases. They say that only the federal government can regulate interstate commerce. So the federal government says, okay, we want the farmers to vote for us. So the federal government and the politicians there are going to pass the Interstate Commerce Act. This is a very weak effort to regulate the railroads, but think about it. This is the first time that the federal government has made any effort to regulate a corporation. Up until this point, it's been laissez-faire. And up until this point, they've even used the military against the workers. But now the federal government is coming out and trying to regulate big business through that Interstate Commerce Act. The populists also want to regulate money policy. This means the amount of money in circulation. If there's more money in circulation, the money becomes less valuable. We call that inflation. But it also means that the farmers can start charging more for their crops. So up until this point, the United States was on something called the gold standard. So the country had a finite amount of gold available. So the money was based on the amount of gold that they had that they could put into circulation. Unless they got more gold, inflation wouldn't happen because there's only a certain amount of gold to go around. And this makes rich people happy because that means the value of the money that they have in their savings accounts will stay high. It makes poor people sad because the wealthy people are gathering more and more and more gold into their hoard, which makes it harder for the poor people to get money. So the populists want that inflation so there's more money flying around so that they can get more for their crops. And that makes it feel like those mortgages that they are paying over a 15, 20, 30-year window, over time, that's going to feel cheaper because they are collecting more for their crops, but that bill stays the same amount. So it feels like they're paying less for that long-term loan. But that means they got to get off the gold standard. So the answer for the populists is this policy called bimetallism, two metals, gold, but they want to add silver to the gold standard. That would increase the amount of money in circulation, which would make it easier to get that gold. And you can see here, this is the gold standard, very difficult, only nobody's benefiting. Here, bimetallism, two wheels, one gold, one silver, and that would allow them to charge more for their crops. This all comes to a head in the election of 1896. The Republican nominee is William McKinley. Now, William McKinley thinks that he's got an easy campaign here. In fact, they called it the front porch campaign. He just had business go out and do all of the work for him. He didn't travel, didn't campaign a whole lot, but McKinley says that the working class wouldn't want inflation because their wages are not going to go up. And businesses are going to tell their workers that if inflation goes up, they're not going to get paid anymore. So McKinley wants to stay on the gold standard, and this has a message that's going to resonate with the working class. The Democrats are going to merge with the populist party here, and the Democrats are going to nominate this guy. This is William Jennings Bryan. He is a minister. He's also a politician, and he gives a fiery speech when he's nominated for the presidency that you shall not crucify mankind on a cross of gold standard. He's promoting bimetallism. He's saying gold and silver in this cross of gold speech. And he's trying to use biblical language to get the Midwest farmer, the conservative Christians to join with him in this fight for inflation. It doesn't work. Labor is terrified of the fact that their wages will feel like they're going down if inflation occurs because the business owners told them they're not getting a wage rate increase. So this guy here, this guy, this right there, that guy, William McKinley. McKinley's going to win the election in 1896. This is the last gasp where the government really tries to protect the farmers, and now we're starting to transition into an industrial age. Labor is afraid of bimetallism and inflation. Populism begins to decline. And now they're going to start focusing on this idea of maybe possibly having a war with Spain. And one quick note. We talked about the Native Americans having their land stolen. And we talked a little bit about the Dawes Severalty Act in a previous lecture. The Dawes Severalty Act in 1884 essentially forced Native Americans into cultural decline. Their land is going to be taken away from them, and they are going to be left kind of out in the lurch with not a whole lot to grasp onto. They are still not given citizenship until 1924. So even though the Dawes Act was trying to get Native Americans to act in the white fashion, they're not going to be assimilated. They're not going to be considered part of the white community. Even in 1924, they're going to be granted citizenship, but it's just another way to try to trick them out of their land because they're not going to be given rights of equality. They're still going to be discriminated against even in 1924. But that's called the Indian Citizenship Act, and that has a lot of complications to it, but you might see some stuff come up on that. All right, so populist Midwestern farmers, immigration and the new immigrants, very important, and we will talk more about this, the expansion and some of the issues with that in the next lecture.